It's nice to see you all here this evening. Thank you for all coming along, and I hope that the evening will prove interesting for you. But I'd just like to start by remembering why we're here this evening. Obviously this is the Geoff Egan Memorial Lecture, and so I thought we'd start with a picture of Geoff at the conference in Newfoundland in 2010. Obviously many of you will have known Geoff, who had an encyclopedic knowledge of post-medieval finds and artefacts, and was great at sharing his knowledge with everybody. But really he had two other attributes which were sort of particularly important. The first was the breadth of his knowledge. It wasn't just that he knew about artefacts from London or from England, but he travelled the world attending conferences and studying how objects had been traded around the place and how they had come to be used in different parts of the world, as is shown by this conference in Newfoundland. And he was instrumental in getting the society to go to places like America and Newfoundland to look at the material culture there, much of which of course is shared with the material culture we have here, because this is where a lot of it originated and was traded. And the other thing that Geoff was able to do was to take these objects and to interpret them and to tell us the story about the people who had created these objects and whose lives we're interested in as archaeologists. And so I hope that this evening I'll be able to follow in his footsteps and tell you a bit about clay pipes and try and draw some of these aspects out of the study that I've done. So the talk this evening obviously is about goods for the colonies, so I'm essentially looking at trade pipes, the pipes that were made in this country specifically to be traded to other parts of the world. And so I'd really like to try and ask sort of 5 questions this evening about these pipes, just starting basically with what are trade pipes, so that you all know what it is that I'm talking about. What are their particular characteristics? So I'd like to look to see what it is that defines these pipes and makes them different from other types of pipes that we find. To look at how and where they originated, where were these pipes produced, and how did they come to be trade pipes that were moved around the world? Who was it that actually produced them? So I want to look at the actual manufacturers of the pipes. And what is their broader significance to our understanding of the post-medieval world? So hopefully by the end of this talk I'll have addressed some of these issues and given you a broader understanding of these objects, and in particular done, which is what I'm particularly interested in, is taking the artefacts, the objects themselves, and seeing how they can be fitted in to our broader understanding of the post-medieval world itself. So to start with, I want to look at what trade pipes were and what are their particular characteristics. And I think a good place to start is probably this advert that comes from Bristol, and it dates from 1799, and as you can see from the top, it's addressed to merchants, captains of ships and others. So this is specifically aimed at people who are trading in pipes, and particularly people who are going abroad with them, the actual merchants who are travelling to foreign countries taking pipes with them. And it's interesting because it's not just from one pipe maker, but it's a group of pipe makers in Bristol, and their names at the bottom. You can see 4 different pipe makers have got together, so they're not sort of necessarily acting individually, but they're acting collectively to say to the merchants, these are the pipes that we make, and these are the ones that you can buy to sell for your various markets. And they start with the long tobacco pipes, and these essentially are the ordinary clay tobacco pipes that would be used in this country and that were made for everyday use. But even within those, you can see there's a number of different types of pipe that are represented, and they list them, and they also list them as either glazed or unglazed. And this isn't glaze in the sense that we think of it today with a ceramic coating on a glassy coating on ceramics. This is actually burnishing, the polishing of the surface to give it a glossy look, and that's what they called a glazed pipe in those days. So it's the burnishing of the pipes, And as you can see, the burnished pipes always cost more than the unburnished pipes because it takes an extra process to put that polish on them. So they start with the long pipes and ending with the common long pipes. So obviously these are the everyday pipes that people were smoking. But then beyond that, they move on to short tobacco pipes, and they talk about pipes that are suitable for the various different markets. You've got the West Indian market, where they're listing pipes at 1 and 4p a gross and 1 and 2p a gross. So we've got two different prices for the pipes, which indicates they were making two different varieties. And we don't know what these varieties were because we don't have any illustrated catalogues from this period to show the forms of these pipes, but we do know that they were making short pipes in two different styles for the West Indian market. And really we know nothing at all about the West Indian market because there isn't the archaeological evidence coming from India to tell us what pipes were being sent there. And we don't find these things, or if we do find them in this country, we don't recognise them. We need to try and find out what these West Indian pipes actually looked like. They also talk about short pipes for the different American markets. And here we can see a whole range of different types. They're selling them at 1 and 4p a gross, 1 and 3p a gross, 1 and 2p a gross, and a shilling a gross. So you've got 4 different qualities of pipe being made for the American market. They're also making pipes for the Irish and Spanish markets, which again they're selling in different qualities. You've got 1 and 3p, 1 and 2p, and a shilling a gross. And then they also make pipes for exactly the patterns for the African and any other market. So they're quite clearly selling pipes designed specifically to meet a lot of different requirements in different parts of the world. And the one characteristic that we can take from this is that these are basically short tobacco pipes, as opposed to the long tobacco pipes, which are the types that were being produced for the home market, and that's the type of thing that we find on excavations in this country. Now, as I say, this advert dates from 1799, so it's relatively late in date because the period I've chosen is to take from around 1600 through to about 1850, because after 1850 you get very large-scale manufacturers setting up and a different type of pipes being produced. So I'm looking at the earlier production before we get the mass transit of pipes through trains and things around the country. These are pipes that were made specifically for the export market going out of the ports around this country. If we go back in time, we can look a bit earlier perhaps at the lengths that were agreed by the Bristol Company of Tobacco Pipe Makers in 1710. Now in Bristol there was a company of pipe makers was founded, and for the better regulation of the trade they agreed that they were going to try and standardise the types of pipe they were producing. But again, we don't know exactly what these types of pipe looked like. We simply have the documentary records that tell us that they were making long pipes, they were making Dutch pipes, they were making Jamaica pipes, they were making penned heels, whatever they might be, they were making gauntlets, and they were making Virginia pipes. The gauntlets we can probably recognise because the Gauntlet family of Amesbury in Wiltshire was very famous for making pipes in the 17th century, and they marked their pipes with a little gauntlet symbol, and they were famous for the quality of their pipes, so we can maybe link those with those particular variety. But these other pipes are a bit of a mystery because we simply have the names. We don't know specifically what they looked like. But what we can see is that these terms had been in use for a while. Here we have some details from the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies. And this was a company set up in Scotland to try and compete with the English, because of course at the time we were still operating as two separate countries. I mean, there may be moves to try and separate us again, but at that time there were two separate countries, and they were making Short Caledonia. Now this is probably not Caledonia in Scotland, but more New Caledonia, which was the attempt by the Scots to set up a colony in Panama. But they were making Short Caledonia pipes at a shilling a gross, African fashion pipes at 14p a gross, short best pipes at 18 pence, long pipes at 2 shillings, and Virginia pipes, which we don't have a price for, but again, that term Virginia pipes turns up once again as early as the late 17th century. So we can see that throughout the period between the 17th century and the end of the 18th century, pipe makers were advertising a range of pipes which included these particular names for pipes that were being exported. And if we then look at some of the archaeological evidence, we can start to identify perhaps what these pipes actually looked like. Here we have an example from a site at Rainford near Liverpool, where excavations have looked at a manufactory which produced a lot of waste dating from around 1810 to 1840 at the Shell House site. And this was producing quite a wide range of pipes, just some of which are shown here. And you can see they're mainly decorated pipes, and a lot of this decoration is very typical of the Liverpool area at the time. You have various motifs on them, mainly contained in a sort of a panel of decoration, where you have little birds and wheat sheaves and things being put onto the pipes by way of decoration. And they're all much the same size, apart from the one in the bottom left, number 64. And that pipe is much, much bigger than all of the others. And so that particular pipe is interesting because it's not a pipe that we find on excavations in this country, and we can identify that as being a pipe that was being made specifically for the export market. And so when we're thinking about what characteristics might define these export pipes, perhaps size is the first thing we can look at, that the everyday pipes they were making were a fairly uniform size, but the export market required larger size bowls, and that pipe at the bottom is an example of a larger bowl that wasn't made for production, wasn't produced for use in this country, but was being made for export overseas. And if we look at some of the other pipes that come from Shell House, the same site, we can see these pipes, which are very distinctive because, of course, they have the American Eagle on one side and Liberty on the other. And again, we don't find these in this country because, of course, they're export pipes that were being made for the American market. And what's interesting is that the maker's mark IB on the top tells us that this particular bowl was made at the end of the 18th century. And of course, this is immediately after the American War of Independence. And so we can see the Liverpool area pipe makers were responding very rapidly to the demand for pipes from overseas. And despite the fact that we just lost America as a colony, undaunted, they were then churning out pipes which had the American Eagle and Liberty on them. And what's interesting also is that they weren't just making one size of these pipes, but the top one is much larger than the bottom one. So the characteristics that we can start to identify, we have the large pipes as exemplified by the top example, and a slightly smaller one which is a more normal English size, but was also being made for the export market. And then another characteristic we can perhaps identify is the shape of the bowl itself. And the larger illustration at the top here shows a bowl which doesn't have any heel or spur to it. Now this is an interesting form because this type of pipe simply doesn't really turn up in English assemblages at all. It is specifically an export type that we find in large numbers in sites in America and right down into the Caribbean, and it was clearly made for export. And this particular example comes from a site in Virginia, a landing stage where it appears that a shipment of pipes was maybe dropped into the river because a number of complete examples have been found. And at the bottom you can see a complete pipe that has come from this site. And so we can actually see the stem length, which is about 8 inches. And if you remember back to the earlier adverts we were looking at, Virginia pipes were advertised from Bristol at being 8.5 inches long. And so this is almost certainly an example of a Virginia pipe being made for the export market in this country. It doesn't turn up here, it's a very rare form here, but turns up in huge numbers over there. So we can start to identify some of these characteristics of these export pipes. And because the pipes that have a similar form to the ones used in this country are quite difficult to identify, so most of the talk this evening is going to be focused on this particular form of pipe that doesn't have a heel or spur underneath. And this particular form wasn't used in this country until about 1850, which again is why I've chosen that as a cut-off date. So any examples we find before that date can be taken as being specifically produced for the export market. Now sometimes we're able to look at these pipes and find a bit more information about them through the marks and decoration that are attached to them. And you can see here a couple of examples. The one on the left has the initials RT stamped onto the bowl, and that identifies the maker as being Robert Tippett. And in this case, he's actually put his name as well in a cartouche, which is moulded onto the right-hand side of the bowl. And you can see the example on the right. It's a bit blurred, but has his name R. Tippett on the bowl as well. So sometimes we can find these pipes and start to pin down where they were made and who was making them. Sometimes we also find decoration on these pipes. Here's some stem decoration consisting of some lozenges with dots in the middle and bands of milled decoration, and this turns up on these export type bowls. And then occasionally you find makers' initials associated with them. So here's a very similar band which actually has the initials IP on as well, which we can link with a Bristol maker. So we can start to pin down some of these examples and say who was making them and where they were being made. Here's another example showing the sort of thing they were producing. In this case we have a maker's stamp on the bowl with the initials SH, and it's a relief stamp, but again decoration on the stem. But the thing to notice about this pipe is it's actually rather a poor quality pipe. If you look at the shape of the bowl, it's not got a nice clean lines to it. It's rather uneven, and it's got some sort of indentations in it. And the milling at the rim isn't very well applied. Up here, there's this band of milling that they were used to finish rims in the 17th century. And it finishes a bit short. It's at a rather poor angle, and you can see cracks in the clay, and particularly these lumps out of the bowl form here. So although it's been decorated and marked, it's rather a poor quality product, but it's on this particular export type. So what I'm going to be talking about mainly are these plain bowls. Most of them don't have marks or decoration on, which makes them quite difficult to attribute to particular manufacturers or production centres, but we can see from this slide that there is a difference in the forms. The one at the top left here has quite a squat form and quite a sharply angled bowl. The change of angle at the base here is really quite sharp. And this is a pipe that can be dated to the 17th century. It dates from around the second half of the 17th century. And as you go through, the angle sort of tends to become a bit more rounded, and the bowls become a bit larger and more upright. And this might, I mean, these changes are a bit subtle, you know, and obviously I'm not expecting you to be able to take on board all these. I spend all my time looking at pipes, and so you can take my word for it. They do change through time. We can look at archaeological assemblages and get dates for these, and so we can actually produce a bit of a typology to show an evolution of these forms, even where we don't have marks and decoration on them. But in summary, we can then really say that the characteristics that we can identify to help to delimit what these export pipes were are the bowl size, where we're looking for maybe a large bowl, the decorative motifs on them, if they've got things that are associated, for example, with the American market, the stem length if they've got particularly short stems, and the bowl form, particularly this type which doesn't have the heel or spur to it. And these particular characteristics don't all occur together. You maybe just get one or two of them, but they can occur in any combination. But these to help us to identify pipes that turn up in assemblages which are not normal for the British market. So what about the origin of these pipes? Where were they derived from? How did they come into existence? Well, Huey, writing in 2008, wrote a paper in which he argued that the Amsterdam pipe maker Edward Bird introduced this particular heelless form in the 1640s for trade with the American Indians, and he said that this style was subsequently copied by the English pipe makers. But I'm not sure that that really holds water. Edward Bird himself was actually an Englishman who had moved across to Amsterdam to become a pipe maker, and what I'd like to suggest this evening is that we can trace the origin of these pipes much earlier in the 17th century, and that the English were making these at least as early as the Dutch were. So if we look at what we know about these pipes at the moment, this is one of the standard typologies that's used for dating English pipes. It's published by Atkinson and Oswald in 1969, and this is one of the standard reference charts that's used. But if you look at this and hunt through to find evidence for these export pipes, they're really not very well represented. There is one type which doesn't have a heel or spur here, but this dates from after 1850, when this style was sort of accepted into the types that were being used in this country. And there's only one example given, which is this one here, which they date to 1700 to 1740. And so if you're trying to look at these heelless pipes, that's the only dating evidence that's given in the London typology for the production of these things. And we don't fare much better if we go to America. This is the typology of bowl forms published by Ivanhoe and Hume in 1970. And again, it shows these export types, and it gives two examples, one up here and one below it. And he's given dates for these of 1680 to 1710, and then 1720 to 1820. Well, there's a problem in the first place because there's a 10-year gap in the middle, so apparently between 1710 and 1720 none of them were made. And also before 1780 we don't have any evidence for them. And I think that this needs to be corrected because we can actually trace these a lot further back. If we go back to the origins, I think we really need to look at what Robert Cotton was doing in Jamestown in Virginia. Now, the recent Jamestown excavations have produced a wealth of evidence about the early English settlement in the New World. For those of you who don't know, Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement that was established there, and it was founded in 1607, and in 1608 we have a pipe maker, Robert Cotton, is listed as going out to the colony. And from the excavations they found evidence that Cotton was making pipes there. They found the saggers that he was firing the pipes in, and a large number of the pipes themselves. And this is what Cotton was making. We don't know what happened to him. He disappears from the records, and probably, like most of the early colonists, he died quite early in the life of the settlement. So the pipes can be dated to around 1608 to 1615. And he was making these pipes that don't have a heel or spur on them, and are really quite different from the sorts of things he would be making, probably in London, which is where we think he originated. But if we compare them with the Indian pipes that also turn up in the early context from the fort excavations, you can see a similarity. These two examples here are the native Indian American pipes made of red clay, but they have that very distinctive form, which is quite different from the English pipes. And if we put the two together, you can see here at the top is one of the American Indian pipes, and at the bottom one that was made by Robert Cotton. And he was clearly making pipes particularly to trade with the Indians, and this is perfectly in keeping with the whole ethos of the colony at the time. People were being sent out from this country specifically with trades that were thought to be beneficial in trying to establish trade with the Indians, and so Cotton turns up there and he's making pipes that are particularly suited for trading with the Indians, and they're quite unlike anything that was being made back in England at the time. Now, another thing that Cotton got up to was making these pipes with names on the stems. And the names that he put on the stems of his pipes are not just any old names, but these are the names of the major backers for the Virginia Company who had funded and founded the settlement. And so here we can see some pipes. The bottom one's the best one. You can see it says E. Southam, and this is for the Earl of Southampton. And he was one of the major backers. He was also one of Shakespeare's major patrons and one of the top Virginia Company officials. And so Cotton made this pipe in Virginia with his name on it. And it wasn't the only one. There's a whole string of names that turn up on these pipes that have come from the recent Jamestown excavations, including the one that you can see in the middle that I've marked, and it has S.R. Walter on it. And this has been attributed to Sir Walter Raleigh, who, of course, was very famous for his love of smoking, and probably did a lot to popularise it in the court. He famously tried to teach Queen Elizabeth I how to smoke, and has long been associated with smoking. So these pipes were being made in Virginia and almost certainly sent back to England to sort of show what could be done in the New World. These were sort of, if you like, promotional stuff, saying, look, you know, we've set up this settlement, and these are the bigwigs, the key movers and shakers who are being put onto the stems of these pipes. And the link with Raleigh is particularly interesting because if pipes were being sent back, and if Raleigh got these pipes as gifts from the new settlement that had been set up, he would be receiving pipes that didn't have a heel or spur on them and were particularly made for trade with the Indians. And this brings us through to the Walter Raleigh tobacco pouch, which is in the Wallace collection here in London. There's been some debate over the years about the authenticity of this, but it does have the initials WR on it and the date 1617, and it contains an early pipe smoking set. And certainly this has been passed down, the understanding being that it was Sir Walter Raleigh's tobacco pouch. And what's interesting is the two pipes that are in it. And you can see from the photograph here, they don't have a heel or spur on them. If we have a closer look at them, here they are. They're really, really unusual pipes because they have silver mounts and they have mouthpieces that screwed into them, which is you know, very unusual for the period. But so is the bowl form. You know, we don't really find this bowl form on any of the other pipes in England at this early date. And so it seems likely that Raleigh, that these pipes, you know, do belong to Raleigh, and that he was, you know, getting this early form of spurless pipe being introduced. And perhaps most significantly, the bowl forms themselves are not Dutch in style. And so the claim that the Dutch introduced this form isn't sustained by these bowls because they're English style bowls turning up at an early date in this country. And there's, as I say, they're very, very rare in this country, but this is an interesting example that comes from the excavations of Oatlands Palace in Surrey. And this, of course, was a royal residence, and it still remained an important royal residence right through to the Commonwealth period. And some of the sort of mid-17th century pipes that have come from there include these, and the one at the top is interesting because it is a spurless form. So we can perhaps see this particular form being associated with quite high status smokers at this early date, but certainly it's something that was familiar with the English pipe makers that were making these things as special pipes, even if it was for the higher end of the market. So I think we can say that the English pipe makers were making these pipes from the early 17th century onwards, and that really they then became popular at about the same date as the ones that come from the Netherlands from the 1640s onwards. Now, turning to the actual who made them, well, Bristol stands out as the main production centre. It's the most famous production centre because large numbers of pipes from Bristol turn up in the New World. But the background is quite interesting as to how pipes came to be made there, because the city fathers seem to have invited pipe makers in the middle of the 17th century, and they were given the freedom of the city to make pipes and carry on their trade, even though they didn't really qualify under the normal terms. And in 1652, a company of pipe makers was set up in Bristol, and this is one of only two known companies, the other one being in London, where this actually happened, where there were sufficient pipe makers to set up a company. And they established quite a major group of pipe makers there making these pipes for export, and so we can then look at those and see what characterises the pipes from Bristol. And some of the things that we've already seen from the examples I gave earlier turn up there. We find bowls that have maker's marks on the stem and on the bowl. And so here we see two examples that have actually come from Maryland, because we don't get many of them in this country. They were mainly shipped abroad. But the one on the left has stem decoration, which is typical of finds that have come from Bristol. And then the one on the right has a Llewellyn Evans stamp LE, the initials on the bowl, who's a known Bristol pipe maker. They also used incuse initials. That's where the lettering is impressed into the clay. And here we have the initials RT for one of the Robert Tippets, and they were working from the 1660s well into the 18th century, making pipes in Bristol. And again, this example has come from Virginia on one of these spurless export type pipes. And they also use these cartouche marks on the side of the bowl, normally on the right-hand side. And again, a couple of examples there from Robert Tippett. There were probably 4 generations of the family all called Robert, which makes them quite hard to date. But clearly they were making large numbers of these pipes because they're really quite common finds from the New World. And then later on, they produced pipes with decoration on them because 17th and early 18th century pipes generally were plain and didn't have decoration. But here on the right-hand side, you can see an example with fluted decoration on it, which has come from excavations in Bristol and shows that they were putting decoration on the bowls as well. Now, it wasn't just Bristol that was making these pipes, and again, the evidence comes from excavations. And here, from Plymouth, we can see a group of pipes dating from around 1660 to 1680. And this is there's a kiln group, numbers 2 to 10 here. And you can see that number 10 is one of these export-style pipes. And this is a small workshop based on the waterfront down in Plymouth, clearly making pipes that were probably put straight onto ships and sent to the New World. And we can see the same thing with a slightly later kiln group, also from Plymouth. This group dates from around 1690 to 1730, and this particular group only has 7 different types in it, where we were able to identify exactly how many different patterns of pipe the pipe maker was producing. And the top right one is clearly an export type designed to be sent abroad. But interestingly, if you look at the one at the bottom, you can see that the taper on the stem of that is different from the others. If you look at they're all broken, but the long stem pipes have fairly parallel stems, whereas that one at the bottom left has a very tapered stem and clearly wasn't much longer. And so that must be one of these export types. But the bowl form is very similar. If you look at the shape of that bowl, it's really very similar to this one up here, or indeed, fairly similar to most of these. And so they were using a distinctive Devon style of bowl, but making a short version of it, which is almost certainly going to equate to one of these short pipes that we've seen listed in the documentary evidence. And also from Plymouth, we have this pipe, which dates a little later, from around 1700 to 1740. It doesn't come from a kiln group, but the mark on the bowl is very distinctive. It's of a type that turns up in Plymouth, and so does the stem decoration. These sort of triangles interconnected. It's very distinctive of Plymouth production. So even though we don't know who made this, it's almost certainly a Plymouth pipe from a little later, and we can see therefore the Plymouth makers making these spurless export style pipes right through from the mid-17th century into the 18th century. But if we look further afield, we can also find evidence from up in Scotland, for example. And the Company of Scotland was set up to try and break into the monopoly of the English for the foreign trade. And we've seen this before, but looking at the pipes they were making, they ordered all these different types of pipes to be made specifically for them at the end of the 17th and into the early 18th century. And what's interesting is that we've got archaeological evidence. If we go to Panama itself and look at Fort St Andrew, which was only occupied by the Scots for a couple of years between 1698 and 1700 before the Spanish came and kicked them out because they were a bit upset with the Scots trying to set up a settlement in the New World. You can see a range of bowl forms, and most of these are typical Scottish bowl forms, numbers 1, 2, and the ones at the bottom, they're all very distinctive Scottish forms, but the ones in the middle are these particular, gone the wrong way, export pipes. And here's a detail of them, and you can see that they were making a range of different forms, one of which has got the initials PC on, and these we know were actually made by Jean Weems, who was the widow of the Edinburgh pipe maker Patrick Crawford. And so it's interesting to see that a woman was carrying on the business, but she carried on using her deceased husband's initials on the pipes, and these were specifically made for the company, and we have correspondence from them where they were sending to Glasgow for patterns of export pipes that the Edinburgh pipe makers could copy. And so it's really, really interesting. We have the documentary evidence together with the archaeological evidence from Panama showing what the Scots were producing for trade with the Indians in Central America. We also find evidence for production coming from Cumbria. And Cumbria was an interesting area because it was very connected with the tobacco trade, particularly Whitehaven. And here's an example showing pipes depicted on the windows of Tolson Hall, which is near Kendal. If you look at the lozenge on the left, it says that God by this means hath sent what I on this house have spent. And so basically the owner of the hall is showing pipes, and the devices on either side are rolls of tobacco. And so as early as 1638, he was profiting sufficiently from the tobacco trade into Cumbria to be able to enlarge and extend his house and put nice glass windows in it. I'm afraid this is the best photograph I could find of the actual window itself. It's been a bit cracked, but you can see there the pipes and tobacco rolls and the 1638 date put in it. But what's interesting about Whitehaven is that it was part of the Lowther estate, and we have a lot of correspondence from the Lowther estate looking at what they were doing there. And here's a letter from Gilpin, who was the agent for Lowther, saying that in 1697 he had, on his own account, taken the risk of employing a pipe maker again to try and make pipes. And he's saying that he's hoping that they can then produce pipes there. He goes on to say a bit later in 1697 that they've had problems, that they didn't burn very white. They were trying to use local clays from the estate to have another resource that they could use. But by 1697-98, he's able to say that they've actually made some pipes, that they've proved so fine and strong that there's no doubt of their success, and they're as good as the Bristol pipes. And we know then from later documents that from really 1701 right through to about 1713, the estate has pipe workshops producing pipes. They don't say exactly what they're producing, but again the archaeological evidence has shown us what comes out of Whitehaven. And here, from an early 18th century group, possibly kiln waste, we have three different pipes. The one on the top left is a typical local style from the period, but the other two are these export style pipes that were being produced for the overseas market. And the one at the bottom, it doesn't show up very well on the slide, but it's interesting because it has a burnished surface. This has been polished, and if you think back to those early adverts, we were looking at different qualities of pipe being produced at different prices, and so perhaps here we can see different types of pipe being produced for the export market. And then if we move down the coast a bit, we come to Liverpool, which was taking over from Chester in the 18th century. Chester was the main pipe production and trading centre for the northwest until the River Dee started silting up. And then in the 18th century, the Liverpool merchants built a dock where they could bring their ships. And this is the excavations in front of the Liver building for the new Museum of Liverpool, where they found the remains of the Manchester dock, which is the dock gates you can see in the foreground. But what was important is that all the ground that had been made up there was built up during the late 18th and early 19th century and included pipe makers' waste. And we can see here typical pipes that were being made by the Liverpool pipe makers during the 1780s. They have stag's heads and things on them, which are a very distinctive local motif, and also liver birds. The bottom one on the left has a little tiny bird device on it, which gets bigger over time, and that's a liver bird. And these turn up in large numbers in America, so they were certainly being exported. But amongst them, we also find the top three examples here are these export types. And you can see the first one is a particularly large example, so we're finding these large bowls, these export style pipes being made alongside the local forms at a time when they weren't being used in this country. And here are just some examples showing these particular forms of pipe that have come from the recent excavations on the Liverpool waterfront, and including this one which has the initials TD on it. And I haven't got time to go into all the detail behind it, but TD are not the maker's initials, but this became a sort of a pattern type, that TD pipes were made for export, and particularly if you look through into the 18th and 19th centuries in America, you'll find thousands of pipes of lots of different forms with TD on them. And here we've got an export style being made in Liverpool in the early 19th century for the export market. And also they were making this type of thing. This is a photograph showing one of these bowls with the American Eagle and Liberty on, that was actually turned up in America, but was almost certainly made at one of these waterfront workshops in Liverpool. And finally we come to London, where there's very little evidence in terms of production waste, but there are some particularly distinctive marks. I'm afraid the detail isn't shown here, but the mark across the stem of this has the initials AA, and it's flanked by an X on either side. And if I log examples of these, they don't turn up in Bristol at all, but there are a number of examples from London, and then lots of examples from the New World. So it's clearly an export type, and the only evidence we've got for them being in this country is from London, so I'm confident that these can be put down as London examples, possibly made by Anthony or Arthur Andrews, who's recorded the late 17th, early 18th century working in London. And you also find similar ones with initials IF, which also have the X on either side, which must be another London version. And we know from other sources that London pipe makers were making lots of pipes for export markets to the Baltic and so on. So there's no surprise that they were making these pipes for the Atlantic trade as well. And then slightly later on, they were clearly making these types with the moulded decoration on, the Prince of Wales feathers at the top and the Hanoverian arms at the bottom. And these clearly say on the stems, Williams, Kent Street, London, but these examples all come from Bermuda. I haven't seen any examples from London, but there's no doubt they were being made there. And again, these were for the export market, and these date from the first half of the 19th century. So we can certainly put London down as a production centre for these export pipes. So if we plot these places on the map, you can see that right from Scotland, from Edinburgh and Glasgow, down through Whitehaven on the Cumbria coast, Liverpool, right down through Bristol and to Plymouth, and right round to London, pipe makers in all these centres are making export-style pipes for the Atlantic trade. And I've also included on there Chester and Exeter, where we know that pipes from those centres are found in the New World, not specifically the heelless form, but it's quite likely they will turn up because we don't have enough excavated evidence from this country. So why are these pipes important? What's the significance of looking at these things? Well, I suppose the first thing is the quantities they were being made in. Here we go back to the Company of Scotland looking at the pipes they ordered. They were only in existence for about 4 or 5 years until the whole thing collapsed. But here are the orders that we know they placed, and there were probably other orders that aren't documented as well. And we can see that in those few years, they ordered more than 250,000 pipes for the export trade. And that gives an idea of the quantities of these things that were being produced. And then another reason they're interesting is because of the international connections that are reflected in the pipe makers themselves. Here are some of the actual pipes that come from one of those kiln groups from Plymouth I mentioned, and you can see the top bowl forms are very distinctly West Country forms, typical of Devon. The bottom one is an export type. And we've seen this in all the production centres. The pipe makers were making local style bowls for the local markets, so they were operating at a local level, but then they were also making these export types of a particular form to suit the export markets. So individual pipe makers were working, if you like, at two different sort of intensities, looking for the local markets and the international market. And even though they were aware of the international market, they didn't standardise their other forms. They still catered for local regional styles that were being produced at this date. Now another reason they were important is because of the slave trade. And we can see here the Edinburgh Company was getting advice on what they needed to set up this trading post in Panama. And they were looking at what they needed for the slave trade, and it includes 20 gross of pipes for shipping 450 slaves from Africa to the New World, which works out an average of 6.4 pipes per slave. And we know from other records from Bristol and from London that the merchants there were doing the same thing. So although this was part of the slave trade, they were actually providing pipes for the slaves that were being carried, as well as needing them for bartering for the slaves themselves. We do have records of pipes being purchased for, slaves being purchased for pipes, and so that they were an important trade commodity for these companies. And so we can see the pipes from England and from Scotland. I haven't had time to look at all of these centres in detail, but there's an arc that goes, and these are all places where large numbers have been found in Newfoundland, in Quebec, through the Chesapeake Bay, right round into the Caribbean, through Jamaica, Dominican Republic, down to Nevis, and in Panama, and lots of places in between. We find these export pipes. They were a crucially important part of the export trade, and particularly the slave trade. And this is a blank on the map, really, that Africa, we don't have any archaeological evidence, but I'm quite sure that when sites there get looked at from the 17th and 18th centuries, these pipes made in Britain will turn up as an important part of the commodities that were being used as part of this trade across the Atlantic. So in summary, we can see that a range of characteristics can be used to identify trade pipes, so we can recognise them amongst archaeological assemblages, and we can show that they were being produced in Britain from the early 17th century onwards. So this goes against the typologies and the papers that have been written. We can see a typological progression of the bowl forms can be established over time, so we can use them for dating purposes, and that the production of them was widespread and initiated at both a corporate and an individual level. In Bristol we saw the city fathers setting up pipe making. In Scotland it was a companies particularly set up for trade. In Whitehaven it was the Lowther estate. In Plymouth we've got individual small workshops making them. The individual makers were making for both the local and individual the international markets, and they were made in very large numbers. I mean, the quantities that are recorded out through Bristol run into many millions of these pipes. So they have a broader significance in understanding colonial archaeology right across the Atlantic world. And so I hope that this talk will have made you appreciate these rather plain and rather boring looking pipes a little bit more, and show that there was a significance to these, and that really a more detailed study of them, particularly from Africa, would help our understanding of Atlantic trade throughout the post-medieval period. Thank you very much.